The fog over Paris that night seemed more than weather. It was a silence, a heaviness that dulled the lamps along the Quai des Orfèvres and blurred the outlines of the bridges. The Seine moved sluggishly under the arches, carrying with it the tired secrets of a city that pretends to sleep but never truly does. Somewhere in that darkness, the mystery had already begun, though no one yet had the courage to give it a name. By morning, whispers would spread of photographs arriving at newsrooms and cafes, portraits with faces scoured away, as though some hidden hand had erased not only features but identity itself. When Inspector Maigret, pipe clamped between his teeth, first heard the rumor, he did not smile. There was something in the story that felt colder than the damp stone of the police headquarters, something that suggested not prank nor curiosity, but an act that hinted at obsession. In a city that thrived on faces, the politicians, the prostitutes, the poets, the clerks, there was a deliberate cruelty in removing them. It was, in its way, an assault on the very idea of recognition, of being seen. Paris is a city accustomed to scandal. It has watched lovers throw themselves into the river, politicians destroy reputations with a word, and criminals vanish into alleys that no policeman could ever map. Yet these erased faces, touched another nerve, and Maigret, as always, would need to leave the warm familiarity of his office, step into the fog, and search. Not for a criminal in the conventional sense, but for a shadowy presence that seemed to move between the cafes of Montparnasse, the garrets of Saint-Denis, and the hidden chambers where people hid, not from justice, but from memory itself. And if you find yourself drawn into this shadowed case, if the idea of mysteries unfolding under the pale glow of street lamps and the smell of damp stone holds you, I ask you to stay with us. Like Maigret following footprints in the fog, follow this story through its twists and shadows. Subscribe, share, and keep close to the trail, for what begins with a photograph may end in a confession whispered too late. The first photograph arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres on a Monday morning that had begun like any other, with the low fog pressing down on the Seine and the dull throb of engines echoing from the bridges. Maigret sat at his desk, pipe smouldering gently, the windows still misted from the dampness of the night. Outside, the routine murmur of Paris carried on, footsteps hurrying over the cobbles, the faint whistle of a barge easing under Pont-Neuf. Janvier brought in the envelope without ceremony, as though it were another of the countless anonymous letters that crossed the inspector's blotter each week. Yet the moment Maigret slid his thumb under the flap and drew out the photograph, the ordinary rhythm of the day faltered. It was a portrait, formal, stiff, the kind taken in provincial studios where men and women sit upright before painted backdrops, their hands folded or resting on chair arms. The clothing was unremarkable, a dark jacket, a blouse buttoned to the throat, but where the face should have been, there was nothing, not blurred, not shadowed, not hidden by accident of light or a smear of handling, but deliberately erased. The features had been scoured away, leaving behind an oval void, pale and raw against the darker tones of the body. It was as though the subject had never existed, or had been stripped of existence after the fact. Maigret turned the card in his heavy fingers, examining it without a word. There was no writing on the back, no studio name stamped in the corner, no indication of who the subject might have been. Only the deliberate absence, the cruelty of removal. Lucas leaned in to glance at it, his brow furrowing. "A prank?" he suggested, though without conviction. Janvier shrugged, but Maigret's silence was heavier than either man's words. By midday, 2 more had arrived, each in plain brown envelopes, each without a return address, each bearing the same erasure. A woman in a wedding dress with her face gone, leaving only the whiteness of veil and gown. A boy in school uniform, his hands clutching a cap, but his face scraped away as though the print itself had been wounded. The precision of it unsettled the men in the office more than they cared to admit. Photographs, after all, were not only images but evidence of life, tokens families clung to, proof against forgetfulness. To strip them was to deny the very existence of the people captured in silver salts and paper. By evening, whispers spread among the journalists who loitered outside the police headquarters, waiting for scraps of scandal. A photograph had turned up at the offices of Le Petit Parisien, and another at a café in Montmartre. No one admitted to knowing the faces that had been erased, but everyone seemed certain they recognized the clothing, the posture, the background of the studio. One rumor claimed a deputy of the chamber had received such an image in his private post, another that a famous dancer at the Folies Bergère had broken into tears upon opening hers. In the smoky air of the cafes, the speculation thickened until it seemed the whole of Paris was waiting for its own erased likeness to arrive. That night, Maigret walked home slowly through the fog. His hat pulled low, his overcoat damp at the shoulders, he moved not with urgency, but with the heavy patience that marked his every case. He did not yet know what crime had been committed, only that something had shifted in the city's rhythm. The lamps along the boulevard cast blurred halos in the mist, and the smell of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor mingled with the acrid smoke of coal fires. He thought of the photographs again, of the faces rubbed away by some determined hand, and the faint unease deepened. At home, Madame Maigret was waiting with a pot of stew that had been simmering all day. She asked little about his work, though her eyes lingered on the fatigue that lined his face. He ate quietly, the warmth of the meal chasing away the chill, but the image of the faceless boy in his school uniform remained. Later, as he filled his pipe and settled into the armchair, he wondered not about the technique. He could imagine the scraping, the chemicals, the deliberate strokes of abrasion, but about the motive. Why erase? Why send them? To frighten? To mock? Or was there something more personal, more intimate, hidden beneath the silence of those mutilated portraits? The following morning brought another envelope, this one delivered not to headquarters but directly to Maigret's office. Inside, a photograph of a middle-aged man in a stiff collar and waistcoat, his posture rigid, his hands resting on his thighs. The face was once again gone, scraped into a hollow absence. Yet this time a single clue remained. In the lower corner, faint but legible, was the mark of a photographer's studio, Atelier Morel, Rue Saint-Denis. It was enough. By the time the fog had lifted slightly, Maigret was already walking the streets of that quarter, his coat buttoned against the chill, his pipe clenched between his teeth. The Rue Saint-Denis was alive with its usual mixture of bustle and sordidness, shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, women leaning from windows, errand boys darting between carts. The photographer's studio was a narrow doorway squeezed between a tobacconist and a bakery, its window cluttered with sample portraits now dulled by dust. Inside, the air smelled of chemicals and old paper, of curtains that had not been washed in years. The photographer himself, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous manner, recognized Maigret at once. He admitted that the photograph was his, one of dozens he had taken years earlier, but he could not say who had sent it to the inspector. Clients came and went, he explained. Negatives were kept in drawers, often forgotten. Who could say who might have asked for a copy, or who had stolen one from the piles left behind? He wrung his hands as he spoke, and his eyes flicked constantly to the empty corners of the studio, as though the faceless subjects might emerge from the shadows to accuse him. Maigret listened, his questions few, his gaze steady. He noted the drawers where negatives were kept, the careless stacks of old prints, the way the man flinched when asked whether anyone had recently inquired about past clients. The photographer hesitated, then mentioned a man, tall, with a dark coat and a hat pulled low, who had come a week ago asking to see portraits taken more than 10 years earlier. He had not given his name, and the photographer, eager for a few francs, had not pressed the matter. Back at headquarters, Maigret spread the photographs on his desk. The erased bride, the faceless child, the hollowed man from Rue Saint-Denis. He studied them in silence, pipe smoke curling upward in slow tendrils. Each image had once been a fragment of a life, an attempt at permanence. Now they were disfigured, their permanence transformed into absence. It was not destruction for its own sake. It was too precise, too deliberate. It was something closer to obsession. Paris, meanwhile, was stirring uneasily. The newspapers began to print brief columns about the mystery. The public speculated with a mixture of fear and fascination, and every café seemed to have its own version of the story. Some whispered of blackmail, others of a madman with a camera, still others of a political conspiracy. For Maigret, such noise was distraction. He sat in his office late into the night, the fog pressing once more against the windows, the sound of the river carrying through the silence, and he thought only of the missing faces. And so the case began, not with a crime that could be measured in stolen francs or blood spilled on the cobblestones, but with an absence, a void where identity should have been. It was, in its way, more unsettling than murder. For murder ended a life. This instead seemed to deny that a life had ever existed. The fog had thinned by the time Maigret stepped into the small Café Tabac on the corner of Boulevard de Sébastopol. But the air inside was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour-sweet odour of pastis. The place was half-filled, though it was still early for the evening crowd. A handful of men bent over newspapers, a pair of clerks sipping coffee before catching their trains, 2 women in shawls speaking quietly near the stove. The proprietress, wiping down glasses with a cloth that was hardly cleaner than the wood, nodded at Maigret without surprise. He was known in such places, not for flamboyance, but for the calm inevitability of his presence. He had a way of sitting, large hands resting easily on the table, pipe smoke curling steadily upward, that made people forget he was listening until they found themselves speaking more than they intended. He ordered a calvados and let the glass sit untouched for a while, eyes wandering without urgency. On the counter, next to a stack of lottery tickets and cigarettes, lay that morning's paper folded open to a small column. The words leapt easily. Another photograph had been found. This one slipped under the door of a Montparnasse studio in the night. The article was sparse, but the headline had done its work. A murmur ran through the café, low conversations in which the word photographs surfaced again and again, as if the mystery had already become part of the city's ordinary gossip, like the price of coal or the latest scandal in the Chamber of Deputies. One of the clerks at the neighbouring table leaned toward his companion. "I swear," he said, voice lowered. It was her. "You remember that girl who worked at the dress shop on Rue du Temple? She disappeared last year. They said she married some fellow in the provinces. That photograph in the paper, it was her. Only..." His voice trailed off, and the other man shook his head uneasily. The women by the stove spoke more cautiously. "It's a warning," one whispered. "Don't you see? Someone wants to frighten us, to remind us we are nothing. A face can vanish, and then so can you." Her companion muttered a prayer and pulled her shawl tighter, as though erasure might enter with the smoke through the cracks in the door. Maigret listened without appearing to. He finally raised the calvados to his lips, the apple spirit biting warmly at the back of his throat, and let the conversations flow around him. It was not the words themselves he sought, but the currents beneath them. The nervous laugh, the sudden silence, the glance toward the door. Fear was a scent that lingered in the air, sometimes sharper than tobacco, sometimes faint but unmistakable. Tonight it was present. He struck up conversation with the proprietress when she came to collect empty glasses. "Strange business, these photographs," he remarked, as if in passing. She shrugged, though her eyes flicked to him with curiosity. "Everything is strange these days, Monsieur Maigret. People say things, they imagine things. One customer swore he saw a man buying a stack of envelopes last week, thick ones, the kind you'd use for photographs. Paid in coins, never spoke a word. Who knows? Could be nothing." Her words were tossed out lightly, but Maigret caught the faint tremor in them. He asked no direct question, only nodded, and she went back to her work. A moment later, one of the men at the far table rose, pulled his hat low, and left without finishing his drink. By the time Maigret stepped outside again, the night had deepened. The lamps along the boulevard cast pale halos on the damp pavement, and the noise of a distant accordion drifted from another cafe down the street. He walked slowly, pipe clamped in his teeth, his thoughts moving with the rhythm of his heavy stride. Each rumour, each fragment of overheard conversation was like a piece of ash carried on the wind. Alone, they meant little. Together they formed a haze, difficult to see through but impossible to ignore. At Montparnasse, the cafes were louder, crowded with students, artists, and wanderers who made their living in ways not easily explained. The smoke here was thicker, the laughter sharper, the conversations more daring. Maigret pushed open the door of a cafe that seemed to hold every kind of voice at once, poets declaiming in hoarse tones, women with painted lips laughing too loudly, young men gesturing wildly as if the world depended on their arguments. He settled into a corner where he could see without being seen. Almost at once he heard the word again, photographs. A young man with an unruly scarf was telling a story to anyone who would listen. I posed for him, yes, years ago when I still thought myself handsome. He came to my attic room, said he wanted to capture the soul of Montparnasse. Do you know what became of that portrait? Erased. My features gone, as though I never existed. He laughed, but there was unease in it, and his audience laughed with him only out of habit. Others joined in. A waitress muttered that she had seen a man carrying a satchel full of papers, slipping into side streets as if hiding from the lamplight. A painter insisted that photographs were always lies anyway, and perhaps erasing them was an act of truth. But beneath the bravado, Maigret felt it again, that faint chill, that sense of something larger than coincidence threading through the lives of these ordinary and not so ordinary people. Later, as the cafe emptied and the last glasses were drained, Maigret lit another match for his pipe and watched the flame flicker against the smoke-stained walls. A thought stirred quietly at the edge of his mind. These erasures, this spreading rumour, they were not only attacks on individuals, but on the very fabric of recognition. Faces were how Paris lived, in posters, in portraits, in glances exchanged at cafe tables. To strip them was to strip away belonging. Whoever did this understood not only the mechanics of photography, but the psychology of a city. On his way back to the Quai des Orfèvres, the streets seemed both familiar and newly hostile. Every poster half torn from a wall, every shadow slipping around a corner, looked like another erasure in progress. By the time he reached his office, the hour was late and the building nearly silent. He sat heavily at his desk, laid the fresh reports beside the old photographs, and stared at the faceless images until the pipe smoke blurred them into something less than human. He thought of the man in the Café Tabac who had left abruptly, of the photographer on Rue Saint-Denis wringing his hands, of the women whispering by the stove. Each was a piece of the puzzle, yet none revealed the whole. Somewhere in Paris, a man was watching the city through a lens, not to capture its faces, but to obliterate them. And Maigret, in the stillness of his office, knew with certainty that the game had only begun. The night pressed close outside the windows. The river moved sluggishly under the bridges, carrying with it secrets whispered in cafes and scrawled in envelopes. Maigret leaned back, eyes heavy, but his mind restless. Tomorrow there would be more whispers, more rumors, and, soon enough, there would be another photograph. The next morning brought a brittle clarity to the sky, though the air still smelled of damp stone and coal smoke. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret sat before a heap of files and envelopes, pipe clamped steadily between his teeth, when Lucas came in with a thin smile that barely concealed excitement. A new lead, he said, had just arrived. A tobacconist in the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Antoine had received one of the faceless photographs, slipped beneath his door during the night. But unlike the others, this one bore the faintest trace of a watermark, the name of a photographic supplier on Boulevard Beaumarchais. It was a slender thread, but threads were what Maigret followed best. By mid-morning he was on the boulevard, walking with his heavy, patient stride past rows of shops that smelled of chemicals, glass, and varnish. The supplier, a round-shouldered man with spectacles, seemed nervous at the sight of the inspector. Yes, he admitted, he remembered selling a packet of special photographic paper recently, the kind used by professionals rather than amateurs. The buyer had been quiet, deliberate, his money laid out in neat coins. He wore a dark coat and a hat that shaded his features. Had he given a name? No. But he had asked peculiar questions about old emulsions, about processes seldom used anymore, as though he were more interested in the history of photography than in its present. Maigret left the shop and continued down the boulevard, his breath visible in the morning chill. He imagined the unknown man moving along these same pavements, his satchel heavy with chemicals and plates, his mind bent not on capturing faces but on obliterating them. The thought carried a certain bleakness. Photography was supposed to be permanence, memory fixed against the passage of time. Yet here was someone who turned that permanence into absence. At noon, Maigret paused in a café near Place de la Bastille, its windows clouded with steam from the midday rush. He ordered a glass of beer and let his thoughts settle into the murmur of voices around him. A man at the counter, with the air of one who lived by gossip, spoke of an itinerant photographer who haunted the edges of the markets, offering cheap portraits to anyone with a few coins. Some remembered him from fairs in the provinces. Others swore he had once kept a studio in Montmartre before vanishing. Always the same detail returned. No one recalled his name. He was like a shadow moving from quarter to quarter, his presence acknowledged only in fragments, as though the city itself had conspired to erase him. That evening, at headquarters, Maigret summoned Janvier and Lucas to review the fragments they had gathered. On the desk lay the photographs with their hollowed faces, the notes from the tobacconist, the supplier, the gossip of the markets. None of it formed a portrait, yet together it suggested a figure who thrived on anonymity, who sought not fame nor profit, but the peculiar satisfaction of effacing identity. "It's not madness," Maigret said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "It's obsession, and obsession has its own logic." Later, as the lamps flickered on across the city, Maigret found himself drawn once more to the narrow streets of Montmartre. The quarter still held remnants of its old bohemian life, small studios with dusty windows, cafes filled with struggling painters, stairways climbing steeply into fog. He stopped outside a shuttered shop whose sign had once read Photographie d'art, the letters now faded and peeling. Through the cracked glass he glimpsed the shadowy remains of tripods and backdrops abandoned long ago. A neighbour, an old woman with a shawl drawn tight, told him in a whisper that a man had returned there a few nights earlier, fumbling with a key, slipping inside for an hour before disappearing again. She had not seen his face, only the dark outline of his coat. The image lingered as Maigret walked back downhill. Somewhere behind these shuttered doors, a man was hiding among negatives and forgotten portraits, scavenging from the past to feed his obsession. Maigret could almost picture him bent over a tray of chemicals, the red glow of a lamp falling on photographs that once bore smiling faces, his hands working with slow precision to erase them, stroke by stroke, until only the void remained. At home that night Maigret sat in silence while Madame Maigret mended a seam. He felt her eyes on him, gentle but questioning. She asked nothing, but her presence sharpened his thoughts. This faceless photographer, whoever he was, lived not entirely in the shadows, but at the edges of ordinary life, buying paper from a supplier, slipping into a shuttered studio, walking the markets like any other man. He was not a phantom. He was flesh and bone, with a name he refused to use. And that was what made him dangerous. The following days brought more reports. A cab driver recalled carrying a passenger who carried a satchel that smelled strongly of chemicals. A bookseller claimed a man had asked about obscure manuals on photographic techniques from the last century. A woman in Belleville insisted she had once posed for him years earlier, though she could not recall when or where. Each testimony was uncertain, tinged with the haze of memory, yet each pointed toward the same ghostly figure, a photographer who was known yet unnamed, seen yet unrecognized. One night, Maigret stood alone at the window of his office, looking out over the Seine. The lamps along the quays shimmered faintly in the black water, and the mist carried the smell of the river into the room. He drew on his pipe and thought of the erased faces, the careful precision of their destruction. Whoever did this understood not only photography, but people. He knew how deeply Paris cherished its images, how families guarded their portraits like treasures, how the press thrived on likenesses of politicians and dancers. To obliterate faces was to strike at the city's most fragile nerve, its need to be seen, remembered, known. He turned from the window and looked again at the photographs spread across his desk. The faceless bride, the hollowed child, the rigid man from Rue Saint-Denis. They stared back at him with their emptiness, and he felt the peculiar weight of the case settle deeper onto his shoulders. He knew then that the man he sought would not be caught easily. This was no common thief or murderer who left behind fingerprints or weapons. This was someone who moved in silence, who left only absence behind. Still, Maigret's patience was greater than silence. He would wait, he would listen, he would follow the faintest thread until it led to the man in the shadows. For in Paris, no one remained unseen forever, not even a photographer without a name. And as the clock in the corridor struck midnight, Maigret tamped the ash from his pipe, his eyes steady on the hollow faces. Somewhere in the city, the man was working even now, bending over another portrait, erasing another life. The inspector felt the certainty of it as palpable as the fog outside the window. The case was no longer merely curious, it was a pursuit, and it would not end until the man behind the lens was found. The Seine was swollen with rain that morning, its waters running thick and brown beneath the arches of Pont Marie. Barges moved sluggishly against the current, their engines thudding like weary hearts. Along the quays, a mist clung stubbornly to the cobbles, and the air smelled of wet stone and riverweed. It was there, near the steps leading down to the water, that a fisherman found her. At first he thought it was only driftwood caught against the embankment, but the pale colour of skin beneath the weeds made him call out, and soon a crowd had gathered. By the time Maigret arrived with Janvier at his side, 2 gendarmes were already keeping onlookers at bay, their whistles shrilling uselessly against the press of curious faces. Maigret pushed through without hurry, his pipe unlit between his teeth, his heavy overcoat damp with river mist. She lay half in the water, half on the slick stone steps, her hair spread like dark kelp, her skirt twisted around her legs. The river had left its mark on her, the pallor of the skin, the stiffness of her hands, the faint bruising where the current had pressed her against stone. But it was not the condition of the body that drew Maigret's attention, it was what she carried, clutched tightly in one hand, as though she had fought even in death to keep it, was a photograph. Janvier knelt and pried it gently from her fingers. The paper was soaked, edges frayed, but the image was still visible. A portrait, unmistakably in the style of a studio. The subject seated stiffly, a curtain behind. And once again the face had been erased, gouged out until only the void remained. The murmurs of the crowd thickened, pressing closer until the gendarmes barked and shoved them back. Someone muttered that it was the faceless photographs again, that even the river could not hide them. Another spat into the water and crossed himself. Maigret bent lower, the sour smell of the Seine in his nostrils, and studied the photograph. It was not one he had seen before. "Any papers?" he asked, his voice low. Janvier shook his head. "Nothing. No purse, no letter, only this." They lifted her carefully, laid her on a stretcher, and carried her up to the waiting van. The crowd followed with their eyes, whispering theories already forming like smoke. She had been murdered, she had thrown herself in, she had been cursed by the faceless man. Rumour was always faster than fact, and Maigret felt the weight of it settling already on his shoulders. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the drowned woman lay in the tiled cold room beneath the headquarters, the gas lamps flickering against whitewashed walls. A doctor examined her with detached efficiency. Drowned, yes, but with marks on the wrists that suggested binding. Not suicide, then, perhaps not even an accident, a death that resisted simple explanation, and in her hand the emblem of the mystery that already haunted Paris. Maigret stood by the table, pipe smoke curling slowly upward. He watched the woman's still face, unremarkable in its ordinariness, the kind one might pass in the street without noticing. Yet she had been chosen, or perhaps she had chosen herself, to carry this photograph. Why? What connection lay between her and the faceless portrait spreading through the city? That evening, as the gas lamps flared against the fog outside, Maigret walked the embankment where she had been found. The Seine rolled darkly beneath him, carrying barges loaded with coal and timber, their lanterns swaying in the mist. He paused where the steps dipped to the water and lit his pipe, staring into the current. He could almost see her again, the photograph clutched in her hand, as if she had wanted to ensure someone would find it, as if it were a message rather than a possession. He returned home, late. Madame Maigret had kept the stew warm, but she asked no questions as he ate in silence. Only when he set down his spoon did she glance at him and say, in her calm, domestic way, "She must have wanted someone to know." He looked at her across the table, surprised, though he should not have been. Madame Maigret rarely speculated, but when she did, her words often struck nearer to truth than all the reports of his men. The next morning he sent Lucas to comb the quarter near Pont Marie, questioning stall-keepers, boatmen, washerwomen, anyone who might have seen the woman before she entered the water. A description formed slowly. She had been seen in a cafe 2 nights earlier, sitting alone, staring at a folded photograph on the table. She had spoken little, asked only for coffee, left before midnight. No one knew her name. In another cafe, a man remembered more. She had been approached by someone, a man in a dark coat, tall, with a satchel slung over one shoulder. They had spoken briefly, in hushed tones. She had seemed nervous, then he left, and she lingered a while before slipping away. The man could not recall his face, only the shape of him, the darkness of his coat. But Maigret knew already what he would have seen, the shadow of the photographer. That afternoon, in his office, Maigret laid the soaked photograph beside the others. The erasure was the same, deliberate, obsessive, precise. Yet there was something different about this one. The dress of the subject was provincial, the backdrop simple, the style older. Perhaps the photograph had been taken years earlier, perhaps in some small-town studio. If so, then the reach of this mystery extended beyond Paris, into the provinces, into forgotten lives that the city seldom remembered. For hours he sat, the photograph spread before him, the smoke from his pipe clouding the lamplight. He thought of the woman's hand gripping the image, as though she feared it might be lost, as though it were the only clue she could offer. He thought of her meeting with the man in the cafe, her nervous departure, her silent walk to the river, and he wondered whether she had died because of what she knew, or because of what she had seen erased. The press seized on the story the following day. "Faceless woman." "Found in Seine," shouted the headlines, and Paris thrilled with speculation. Was she a victim of the mysterious photographer? Was she part of a conspiracy? The cafes hummed with theories, and the police received calls from hysterical citizens certain that their own portraits had been tampered with. Maigret ignored the clamour. He cared nothing for headlines. What mattered was the silence of the drowned woman and the photograph clenched in her hand. That night he dreamed of the faceless portraits. He saw them floating down the Seine like pale masks, spinning in the current, their hollow centres staring upward into the fog. He woke with the bitter taste of the dream still in his mouth, and for a long while he sat by the window, pipe in hand, watching the city breathe beneath the mist. He knew now that the case was no longer a curiosity. A woman was dead, and her death was bound inseparably to the photographs. Whether she had been a victim chosen at random or part of some darker design, Maigret could not yet say. But he felt the net tightening. Somewhere in the city, the photographer without a name had crossed paths with her, and in that meeting lay the key to everything. The Seine rolled on outside, indifferent and eternal, carrying secrets past the bridges, past the quays, out toward the sea. Maigret tamped his pipe, his heavy face grave. He would not let her vanish into the river's forgetting. Not while he still walked the quays in his heavy coat, not while Paris still whispered of faceless photographs. Montparnasse at night had its own weather, a climate made not of rain or fog, but of smoke, laughter, and the restless murmur of voices. The cafes spilled their light across the pavements, windows steaming with the breath of too many bodies packed together, while the streets outside were slick with drizzle and echoing footsteps. Painters, poets, waitresses, drifters, all drifted in and out of these establishments like moths around a lantern. For Maigret it was familiar ground, though not a place he sought for pleasure. Here rumour grew as quickly as mould, and the inspector, with his heavy coat and his slow pipe smoke, had long ago learned to sift truth from invention in such air. He began at the Closerie des Lilas, a café that served as both sanctuary and theatre for artists whose pockets were empty, but whose voices were loud. He sat at a corner table, ordered a beer, and let his gaze wander without focus. The walls were hung with fading sketches, the tables cluttered with glasses and crumbs of bread. At one end, a bearded poet declaimed verses that no one listened to, while two painters argued over the price of tubes of colour. Yet amid the chaos, Maigret caught it again, the word photograph. It floated above the din like a half-heard refrain. A young waitress, weary-eyed but sharp, paused by his table. She recognized him, though she pretended not to. "Strange business, isn't it?" she said in a low voice, nodding toward a group of students nearby. "They've been talking all night about a man with a camera. Comes here sometimes. Always alone. He orders coffee, nothing else. Watches people." "Does he take pictures?" Maigret asked. "Never. Not here, at least. But one of the girls swears she saw him in the street, photographing a drunk asleep on the pavement. When she looked again, he was gone." She shrugged and moved away to serve another table, but her words stayed with him. Later, Maigret drifted into the rotonde, noisier and brighter, the air thicker with smoke. A jazz band played in the corner, the trumpet shrill above the clatter of glasses. Here the talk was bolder, half-drunken boasts shouted across tables. A man in a shabby velvet jacket, his face flushed with drink, proclaimed that he had once been photographed by the faceless man himself. "I was beautiful then," he cried, pounding the table. "Now I am nothing. He saw that before anyone else." His companions roared with laughter, but there was unease beneath it. To be photographed by the faceless man was to court erasure, to be half believed, half feared. In another corner, a pale young woman with kohl-rimmed eyes whispered to her companion, unaware that Maigret was listening. "He came to me once, asked if I wanted my portrait taken. I said no, of course. There was something in his eyes, as though he wanted to take more than just my picture." Her companion shivered and ordered another drink. Maigret left without haste, his hat pulled low against the drizzle. The streets of Montparnasse seemed alive with shadows, figures slipping between lamplight, voices carrying through open windows. He walked slowly, letting the city reveal itself in fragments, a man carrying a satchel disappearing into an alley, a scrap of photographic paper blown against the curb, the glow of a red lamp in a studio window where someone still worked at midnight. At a smaller café on Rue de la Gaîté, quieter than the others, he found a group of older men playing cards. Their talk was not of art, but of practical matters, rents, debts, the price of bread. Yet even here the whisper came. One of them mentioned a man with a camera who had offered to take their portraits cheaply, no questions asked. They had refused. "Too hungry-looking, that one," the card player muttered, slapping down a worn ace. "Eyes like someone who sees too much." Maigret lingered, ordered a coffee, and watched. At the next table, a woman in a faded coat studied him openly. When their eyes met, she leaned closer. "You're looking for him, aren't you? Everyone knows." Her voice was hushed, almost conspiratorial. "I saw him once." He sat by the window of a café, watching the rain. He drew faces on a napkin, then crossed them out one by one. "I swear it's true." She shuddered and finished her drink quickly. By the time Maigret stepped back into the street, the drizzle had become rain, tapping steadily on the pavements, blurring the glow of the lamps. He walked back toward the metro, his thoughts heavy. The whispers formed a pattern, though faint, a man who watched more than he spoke, who carried a satchel, who sometimes offered portraits, sometimes vanished before anyone could be sure of him. No one knew his name, yet everyone felt they had brushed against his shadow. At headquarters the next morning, Lucas laid a fresh report on Maigret's desk. A bartender in Montparnasse claimed that a man had left behind a glass, still damp with pastis, and beneath it a slip of photographic paper marked with the same watermark as the others. It was nothing solid, nothing that could be proved, but Maigret felt the certainty grow. The man had been there. He had listened, watched, perhaps even chosen his next subject from among the laughing poets and weary waitresses. That evening, Maigret returned, not to the bright cafes this time, but to the darker corners where rumour curled like smoke. He walked the side streets, the alleys where cheap studios advertised portraits for a few francs, their windows dusty, their lamps flickering. In one such place he found a boy sweeping the floor. The boy admitted that a stranger had come a week earlier, asking to see old negatives left behind by clients who had never returned. He had chosen several, paid in coins, and left without a name. The boy remembered his hands, large and careful, as though they belonged more to a craftsman than to a drifter. When Maigret pressed, the boy hesitated, then produced a scrap of paper left behind in the waste bin. It was the corner of a photograph, torn and smeared with chemicals. The fragment showed part of a shoulder, a hand resting on a chair arm. The face was gone, scraped away. Even in fragments, the pattern was unmistakable. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret spread the scrap beside the drowned woman's photograph, beside the others. The faceless images seemed to multiply, each one a wound in the paper, a silence where a voice should have been. He leaned back in his chair, pipe smoke curling above him, and let the weight of it settle. Montparnasse had given him no name, no address. Yet it had given him something more valuable, the certainty that the man was real, moving among the cafes, choosing his moments, leaving traces too faint for most to notice. And Maigret, with his slow patience, would follow those traces until they formed a path. The city outside hummed with its usual restlessness, but in the inspector's mind a line had been drawn. The whispers of Montparnasse were no longer rumour, they were testimony, however uncertain, and together they pointed toward a figure whose presence grew more tangible with each night. Somewhere among the laughter and smoke, the faceless photographer waited, and Maigret, with his heavy step and his unlit pipe, was drawing closer. It was near midnight when Maigret let himself into the flat on Boulevard Richard Lenoir. The rain had followed him all the way from Montparnasse, soaking the brim of his felt hat and leaving his overcoat heavy on his shoulders. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake his wife, though he knew, from long habit, that she would still be awake, sitting with her sewing in the warm light of the lamp. The air smelled of boiled vegetables, faintly sweet, a reminder that even in the inspector's long absences, the rhythms of the home endured. Madame Maigret looked up from her chair as he entered. She did not ask questions at once, she never did. Instead, she folded her work neatly, set it aside, and waited. He filled his pipe, sat heavily in the armchair opposite her, and exhaled smoke into the quiet. For a long while, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the rain against the shutters. At last she said softly, "You are carrying them home with you again?" He frowned, as though unsure of her meaning. "The faces," she added, her eyes steady on him. Or rather, the lack of them. Maigret let out a grunt that was almost agreement. He had spread the photographs on his desk so many times at headquarters, stared into their voids until they seemed to look back at him. Even now, in the warmth of his home, he saw them in his mind, the bride without features, the child with hollow eyes, the drowned woman clutching her faceless image as she sank beneath the Seine. Madame Maigret poured him a small glass of brandy and handed it across. He accepted it without comment, savouring the slow burn. She did not press, but her silence was a question. Eventually he found himself speaking, not in the clipped tone of the office, but in the weary, honest voice he used only here. "They're not random," he said. "Whoever makes them Whoever erases them chooses carefully. These were once ordinary portraits, family keepsakes. They belonged to people who wanted to be remembered. And now they are gone. Not dead, perhaps, but stripped of their faces. Stripped of recognition. Madame Maigret studied him quietly, her hands folded on her lap. "Why?" she asked simply. The word hung in the room, heavier than smoke. Why? It was the question his men had asked, the journalists had asked. Even he had asked himself in silence, but spoken by his wife, it pierced more deeply. She was not asking about technique or opportunity. She was asking about the human heart. What grief, what anger, what need could drive a man to obliterate identity from paper? Maigret had no answer. He drank again, stared at the carpet, felt the weight of his own silence. He thought of the man described by waitresses and gossipers, tall, in a dark coat, carrying a satchel of papers. Always watching, seldom speaking, a shadow among the living. What did he see when he looked at faces? What compelled him to remove them, to deny their existence? Was it hatred? Or was it a kind of twisted intimacy, a way of holding on by erasing? "You look tired," Madame Maigret said at last. Her tone was gentle, without reproach. She knew the heaviness of his cases, the way they clung to him long after the files were closed. She reached for her sewing again, but did not resume. Instead, she let her fingers rest on the fabric, her gaze still on him. "Perhaps it is not about the people at all," she said. "Perhaps it is about himself." Maigret turned his head toward her, smoke rising from the bowl of his pipe. "Some men," she continued softly, "cannot bear their own reflection. So they erase it wherever they find it." It was not evidence, not testimony, but it struck him with the force of truth. He remembered the stories from Montparnasse, the man who drew faces on a napkin only to cross them out, the young woman who felt he wanted to take more than a picture. If this photographer without a name was erasing others, perhaps it was because he had already erased himself. The thought stayed with him as he went to bed, the rain still tapping against the shutters. He lay awake beside his wife, staring into the darkness, his mind circling the faces that were no longer faces. He realized he had been chasing the void, not the man. And perhaps that was why the pursuit felt endless. The following day, he carried her question with him into the office. Lucas and Janvier were waiting with fresh reports. A clerk had found another photograph slipped beneath his door, this one showing two women seated side by side, their features gone as if rubbed out by the same hand. In Belleville, a cafe owner claimed a customer had left behind a satchel smelling of chemicals. None of it was decisive, yet Maigret listened with renewed focus. The why mattered as much as the who. If he could understand the hunger that drove the faceless man, perhaps he could anticipate his next step. He sent Janvier to comb through old records of photographers, especially those who had left studios abruptly, debts unpaid, names half remembered. He dispatched Lucas to question vendors of photographic supplies once more, this time pressing not for sales but for habits, who lingered, who asked strange questions, who bought items no longer fashionable. And he himself returned to Montparnasse, not to the crowded cafes, this time, but to the quieter corners where people remembered details without realizing they mattered. At one cafe, a laundress told him she had once seen the man sitting alone, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. He had touched his face, then covered it with his hand as though ashamed. At another, a barman recalled him turning away when a group of students began laughing, his shoulders stiff, his departure abrupt. Always the same, a man who recoiled from faces yet could not stop seeking them. That evening, Maigret returned home earlier than usual. He sat once more in the armchair, pipe glowing in the lamplight, while Madame Maigret mended a torn button. He told her of the laundress, the barman, the fragments of testimony. She listened, nodding, her needle moving steadily through fabric. "So he sees himself everywhere," she said, "and each time he cannot bear it." Maigret leaned back, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. Her words had stripped the case of its noise, left only its essence. The faceless man was not striking at others. He was striking at himself, over and over, through the faces of those he photographed. Later that night, as he walked the quiet corridor of headquarters, he paused by the cold room where the drowned woman had been laid. He thought of her hand clutching the photograph, of the void in its center. Was she, too, a mirror for him? Had she seen something in his eyes that no one else had dared to name? Madame Maigret's question still echoed. Why? Perhaps the answer lay not in crime alone, but in sorrow. A man who had erased himself would find no peace until someone else stopped him. And that task, heavy and patient, now belonged to Maigret. He closed the door softly behind him and returned to his office. On the desk, the photographs waited, their hollow faces watching in silence. He struck a match, lit his pipe anew, and stared into their voids. He was closer now, not by evidence but by understanding. The hunt was no longer for a nameless photographer. It was for a man whose own reflection had long since vanished, leaving behind only the erasure of others. The letter arrived one grey morning, carried in the ordinary post, its envelope smudged from travel. It had been forwarded from a small-town commissariat in Burgundy to the Quai des Orfèvres, and its contents at first seemed routine enough. A note from a provincial inspector reporting an unusual matter, requesting advice from Paris. Yet when Maigret unfolded the sheet and the enclosed photograph slid onto his blotter, his pipe smoke hung motionless in the air. It was the same. A family portrait, the stiff posture of Sunday best, the father's hand resting on the shoulder of a child, and all their faces scoured away, leaving pale ovals like ghosts staring from the paper. He sat back heavily, the arms of his chair creaking under his weight. For weeks the faceless photographs had felt like a fever confined to the capital, to Montmartre and Montparnasse, to the quays and cafes where rumour grew quickly. But this was different. The photograph had surfaced in a post office box in a provincial town where gossip travelled more slowly, where faces were fewer and better known. It was no longer a Parisian oddity. It was spreading. By afternoon, 2 more communiques had arrived, one from Lille, another from Tours. Each reported the same, anonymous envelopes left in cafes, photographs altered in the same brutal, deliberate way. Ordinary people, the milliner's daughter, a retired railway clerk, a group of schoolchildren, had opened the envelopes and stared into the voids where features should have been. Panic had begun to ripple in those quieter towns where superstition was often stronger than reason. Maigret gathered his men around the table in his office. Lucas, Janvier, and Lapointe leaned forward as he spread the provincial reports. Their faces showed the same grim recognition. "It is not confined to Paris," Maigret said simply. His voice was calm, but the words fell like weight on the room. "Whoever he is, he travels. He chooses faces beyond the capital. He wants it known that his reach is wider." "Then he must be using the trains," Lucas observed. "Perhaps," Maigret murmured. He imagined the man boarding at night, his satchel of photographs under his arm, stepping off at small stations where the lamps burned yellow against the mist. He would leave his envelopes in post-boxes, in cafes, perhaps even in churches. Then he would vanish again into the rhythm of the rails. That evening, Maigret himself boarded a train bound for the provincial town mentioned in the first letter. He sat heavily in the corner of a second-class carriage, the windows streaked with rain, the countryside unrolling in blurred patches of field and forest. Opposite him, a woman in a black hat dozed with her handbag clutched tightly, while a young soldier leafed through a newspaper. No one spoke. Only the rattle of the train and the whistle of the wind through the cracks filled the silence. Maigret tamped his pipe and thought of the faceless family in the photograph. Who had once posed for that portrait? Where were they now? Did they still live in the town he was approaching, or had they vanished, leaving behind only their erased likeness? The commissariat in Burgundy was a modest office on the edge of the square, its stove giving off too much heat for the small space. The local inspector, a stout man with watery eyes, greeted Maigret with both deference and relief. He produced the photograph, carefully wrapped as though it were evidence of sacrilege rather than crime. The townspeople, he explained, were unsettled. A photograph had been found in the drawer of a cafe counter one morning, its faceless figures unmistakable. Since then, whispers had spread of curses, of a madman, of omens. Maigret asked who the subjects might be. The inspector shook his head. No one recognizes them. The Bonjour studio mark suggests it was taken here 20 years ago, perhaps. The family may have moved away or died, but the faces are gone, and that is enough to frighten everyone. Maigret studied the photograph beneath the glow of the kerosene lamp. The scrape marks were identical to those he had seen in Paris. The hand was the same, patient and cruel. He felt again the weight of the man's obsession, travelling now beyond the city, leaving his mark in villages where anonymity was rare. Here, to erase a face was not only to obliterate identity, but to tear at the fabric of community itself. He spent the night at the local inn, listening to the gossip in the dining room. Farmers, clerks, and washerwomen all spoke of the faceless family, each repeating the story with small variations, each certain that the next photograph would bear the likeness of someone they knew. Fear, he thought, was more contagious than influenza. One photograph was enough to infect a whole town. The next morning he walked the streets, his breath clouding in the cold air, his boots loud against the cobblestones. He visited the old photographic studio whose stamp marked the image. It was shuttered now, dust collecting on its windows. The former owner, a tired man with rheumy eyes, remembered nothing clearly. Yes, he had once taken countless portraits. Yes, many families had posed against his painted backdrop. No, he could not say who had come asking for old negatives, though perhaps someone had. He shrugged, weary, as though haunted by ghosts too numerous to count. Back in Paris, Maigret reported to his men. The pattern was undeniable. The faceless man was moving, carrying his obsession beyond the capital. But why? Was he chasing something, or fleeing? Was each erased portrait a message to the living, or a monument to the forgotten? That night at home, Madame Maigret listened quietly as he described the provincial panic. She shook her head slowly. "He does not want to be confined," she said. "He wants the world to be as faceless as he feels." Her words, spoken simply, carried more weight than any report. Maigret stared into his pipe smoke and thought of the trains again, their black engines pulling him farther and farther, scattering his voids across the map of France. The press, of course, seized upon it. Within days, the Paris papers were running headlines, "Faceless terror spreads to provinces." Journalists filled their columns with speculation, inventing stories of entire villages receiving altered photographs, of suicides driven by fear. Most of it was fantasy, yet it fueled the fire. The public no longer saw the case as confined to the shadows of Montparnasse. It had become a phenomenon, and Maigret knew too well how quickly such noise could overwhelm truth. Still he persisted in his quiet way. He sent Janvier to the railway stations to question porters and ticket sellers. He dispatched Lucas to watch the suppliers of photographic chemicals to trace who might be purchasing unusual quantities. He himself returned to his desk, spreading the photographs before him, studying their scars as if they might yield a map. And as he sat in the lamplight, the river whispering beyond the windows, he felt the truth settle more heavily. The faceless man was no longer hiding in Paris. He was on the move, carrying his voids into the provinces, leaving echoes that disturbed not only individuals but entire communities. The hunt had widened, the shadow had grown larger. Maigret leaned back, his large hands folded on his stomach, and closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear the rhythm of the train again, wheels clattering over rails, carrying a man with a satchel full of photographs, scattering absence like seeds across France. The inspector knew then that the case was not nearing its end, but opening into something deeper, darker. The provincial echo was not the last note. It was only the beginning of a wider chorus. The newspapers were quicker than the police. They always were. By the time Maigret returned from Burgundy, weary from the slow provincial train and the damp that clung to his coat, the kiosks of Paris were already plastered with headlines. "The faceless terror reaches the provinces," screamed one. Another, more lurid, declared, "Anarchist plot to erase France." The sheets flapped wetly in the drizzle, ink running where the rain had caught them, but their words had already spread, whispered in trams, shouted in cafes, debated in offices. Paris thrived on scandal as it did on bread and wine, and the faceless photographs had become its latest nourishment. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the pile of newspapers was almost as high as the stack of reports on Maigret's desk. Each paper carried its own speculation. Some wrote of a madman haunting the boulevards with scissors and knives. Others hinted at secret societies bent on erasing the very identity of citizens. One article described the drowned woman near Pont-Marie in lurid detail, suggesting she had been sacrificed by cultists. Another claimed that entire families were fleeing small towns after receiving faceless portraits in the post. None of it could be proved. All of it was believed. Maigret sat in his office, pipe smoke curling slowly upward, his heavy eyes moving from one headline to the next. He hated such noise. Rumour was bad enough in cafes and markets, but when amplified by print, it became a storm, drowning out the quiet threads of truth. Worse, it gave the faceless man a stage. Each article, each headline magnified his presence, turning him from a shadow into a legend. Janvier entered, dropping a fresh sheet onto the pile. "Another one, Chief. Says he's a former police photographer dismissed in disgrace. Claims he's taking revenge on the force." Maigret grunted, unimpressed. "Tomorrow he'll be a failed painter or a jealous husband. They will invent him a dozen times before we find him once." Still, he could not ignore the effect. The public no longer saw the case as isolated fragments. They saw it as a menace, a phantom that could touch anyone. People arriving at police stations clutched their own photographs, demanding protection, convinced they would be next. Old portraits were burned in stoves by nervous families who feared they might be stolen. Studio photographers complained that clients refused to sit for portraits, afraid their images would be mutilated. Identity itself had become fragile. In the cafes, where Maigret often went to listen, the talk was feverish. At a crowded tabac near the Gare de l'Est, men argued that the faceless photographs were a political act, meant to mock the Republic's obsession with bureaucracy and identity papers. "Erase the face! Erase the citizen!" one man declared, slamming his glass on the counter. Others muttered of German spies, anarchist cells, or vengeful lovers. A young woman swore she had received one of the photographs, though when pressed, she admitted she had only seen it in a neighbour's hands. Truth and invention mingled until they were indistinguishable. For Maigret, the challenge was not only to find the man, but to hold steady against the tide of hysteria. He refused interviews, turned away journalists at the door, and told his men to waste no time correcting every rumour. "We do not chase ghosts," he said. "We chase men." Yet even he could not deny that the faceless man seemed to grow more powerful with each column of newsprint, as if the city itself was conspiring to keep him alive. One evening, after a long day of listening to noise, Maigret walked along the Boulevard Saint-Germain. The kiosks glowed with lamplight, their racks heavy with fresh editions. The headlines shouted at him from all sides, black ink on white paper, each trying to outdo the other in horror. He paused, struck a match for his pipe, and stared at them. Behind the exaggerated words lay a truth he could not ignore. The faceless man had become more than a criminal. He was a story, and stories could not be handcuffed. At home, Madame Maigret was waiting with supper. She ladled stew into his bowl and listened quietly as he spoke of the papers. "They give him what he wants," she said softly. Maigret frowned. "And what is that?" "Attention," she answered. "If he erases faces, perhaps it is because he feels unseen. Now everyone sees him, though no one knows who he is. The newspapers have made him more real than he could ever be on his own." Her words troubled him more than the headlines. If the faceless man thrived on being unseen yet acknowledged, then the press had become his accomplice, feeding his hunger without knowing it. Each photograph sent, each rumour spread, was amplified until it seemed to blanket all of France. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the pressure mounted. Officials demanded progress, politicians whispered of threats to public order, and the commissioner pressed for arrests, if only to calm the public. But Maigret refused to act hastily. He moved with his usual heavy patience, following faint threads, listening more than he spoke. He sent Lucas back to the suppliers, Janvier to the railway stations, Lapointe to cafes where new rumours sprouted daily. He himself continued to stare at the photographs, their hollow faces more eloquent than any newspaper column. One night, returning late from his rounds, Maigret paused outside a café where students were singing. On the wall beside the door, someone had pasted a newspaper clipping, its headlines screaming of the faceless terror. Beneath it, someone else had scrawled in chalk, "Nous sommes tous sans visage." We are all without faces. He stood there for a long time, pipe clenched in his teeth, watching the words smudge slowly in the drizzle. The public hysteria had transformed the case into something larger, almost philosophical. It was no longer only about a man erasing photographs. It was about fear of erasure itself, the terror of anonymity, of being forgotten, of losing one's place in the city's memory. Back in his office, he told his men what he had seen. "He has infected their minds," he said. "That is more dangerous than his photographs. A man can be caught, a fear cannot." The days passed, each one bringing fresh headlines, new rumours, more photographs arriving in envelopes with no names. The pile on Maigret's desk grew until it seemed the hollow faces were multiplying of their own accord. Yet beneath the noise he sensed the man himself drawing nearer, as if compelled by the very attention he had stirred. The press had given him a stage. Sooner or later he would step into the light. Maigret leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the hum of the river beyond the windows. The city was restless, the public feverish, the newspapers insatiable. Yet in the midst of all that clamour he held fast to the quiet patience that had always been his strength. The faceless man was no myth. He was flesh and bone, moving somewhere in the fog. And Maigret would find him, not in the headlines, not in the rumors, but in the silences that still lay beneath them. The lead came quietly, almost reluctantly, as so many of Maigret's clues did. It was not the grand gesture of a confession, nor the sharp crack of discovery, but the half-spoken memory of a concierge in a forgotten quarter of Paris. She told Lucas of a tenant who had not been seen for days, perhaps weeks. A solitary man, she said, who carried parcels wrapped in brown paper, who paid his rent irregularly but always in cash, who kept to the shadows of the stairwell. There was something in her tone, a mixture of fear and disdain, that made Lucas carry the report straight to Maigret's desk. By the time the inspector climbed the narrow staircase of the crumbling building on Rue des Gravilliers, dusk had already settled over the city. The stairwell smelled of cabbage and damp plaster, each step creaking under his weight. At the top floor, beneath a roof that seemed ready to collapse under the rain, he found the door, warped wood, a single rusting lock, silence behind it. He paused, pipe clenched in his teeth, and listened. Nothing but the faint drip of water from the gutter outside. With a nod to Janvier, who had followed him up, the door was forced open. The room inside was not much more than an attic, sloping beams, a single window crusted with grime, and air so thick with the smell of chemicals that Maigret's eyes watered. The floor was littered with scraps of paper, torn envelopes, shards of glass from broken photographic plates. Against one wall stood a rickety table, and on it, beneath the glow of a kerosene lamp, lay a stack of photographs. Maigret stepped closer, his heavy tread careful on the warped boards. He picked up one of the prints and felt the weight of recognition settle in his chest. It was the same hand, the same erasure. A family seated stiffly, their features scraped away. A young girl in communion dress, her smile erased into void. A row of soldiers, their faces gone as though the war itself had devoured them. Dozens of them piled one on top of another, each marked by the same obsession. The room was silent, but it was not empty. From the corner, half hidden in shadow, a figure stirred. A man rose slowly, his coat hanging loose from his thin frame, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollow with sleeplessness. He did not move to flee, nor did he speak. He merely looked at Maigret, then at the photographs scattered across the table, as though the inspector had stumbled into a confession already made. Maigret did not reach for his pistol. He simply stood there, pipe smoke curling from the bowl, and waited. The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable, until at last the man spoke in a voice hoarse from disuse. "They were never meant to last," he said. Maigret said nothing, letting the words hang in the stale air. "Faces," the man continued, gesturing vaguely toward the table. "They betray you. They decay. They lie. I only finish what time begins." His hands trembled as he spoke, and Maigret noticed the stains of chemicals on his fingers, the faint scars where acid had eaten into the skin. He was no longer merely a shadow described in whispers. He was flesh and bone, fragile and haunted. Yet there was no madness in his eyes, only a grim conviction that chilled more than frenzy would have. "Who were they?" Maigret asked quietly, nodding at the photographs. The man gave a thin smile, without humor. "Everyone. Anyone. I found them. I kept them. And when they stared at me too long, I took them away." Maigret studied him in silence, his own heavy face unreadable. He felt Janvier shift uneasily behind him, waiting for orders, but still he did not move. The attic was thick with the presence of absence, the air alive with the weight of erased lives. It was as though they stood not in a room, but in a mausoleum of memory. At last, Maigret stepped to the window, wiping a patch of grime with his sleeve. Outside, the city moved on in its usual rhythm, lamps glowing along the streets, carts rattling on cobbles, voices carrying through the mist. Life continued, indifferent, yet in this attic it had been arrested, captured, and then destroyed. "Why send them?" he asked, turning back. The man's shoulders lifted faintly, then fell. "To remind them, to remind you, that nothing is fixed, that no face is safe." It was not an answer, yet it was the only truth he offered. Maigret let the silence close again. He knew already that this was not the end, not yet. The man had been found, yes, but the meaning of his acts remained suspended, like smoke that refused to clear. Arresting him would stop the spread of envelopes, but it would not erase the deeper void he had carved in the city's imagination. That wound would remain, no matter how many reports were filed, or how many hours the man spent behind locked doors. The inspectors gathered the photographs, stacking them carefully as evidence. The man did not resist when Janvier took his arm, though his eyes lingered on the table as if leaving behind children. As they led him down the narrow stairwell, the concierge peeked from her door, her face pale, her curiosity stronger than her fear. She would have a story to tell the tenants for years to come. How the faceless man had lived above them, erasing lives while they slept. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the interrogation began. Maigret sat across from him, pipe smoke clouding the small room, while the man answered in his slow, quiet way. He gave no name, or gave several, each one discarded like another photograph. He admitted to nothing specific, yet denied nothing either. His words circled, vague and weary, as though he had already said all that mattered in the attic. "Faces do not matter," he repeated once. "They are masks. I only remove them." Maigret leaned back, watching him, trying to pierce the fog of his conviction. He thought again of Madame Maigret's quiet question. Why? Perhaps this was the answer, or perhaps it was only another mask. He could not tell. When at last the man was led to a cell, Maigret remained in the interrogation room, staring at the empty chair. The silence felt heavier than before, as though the man's absence was itself another erased photograph. He tamped his pipe, lit it again, and sat until the smoke cleared. The case, he knew, was not finished. The man in the attic had been found, but the story had grown larger than him. The press would not let it rest. The public would not forget the voids. And perhaps, Maigret thought grimly, there were others who would pick up where he left off, drawn by the strange power of erasure. That night he walked home along the river, the fog curling low over the water. The lamps shimmered faintly, their reflections broken by the current. He thought of the photographs stacked on his desk, their hollow faces staring upward. He thought of the man in the attic, quiet in his cell, his conviction undiminished. And he thought of Paris, restless and whispering, waiting for another envelope, another faceless image. The inspector drew on his pipe, his breath clouding in the chill air. The hunt had reached its peak, yet the silence that followed was more unsettling than triumph. For some cases ended not with resolution, but with echoes, and this, he sensed, would echo for a long time to come. The cell was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace but from exhaustion. The man sat on the narrow bench, his back against the wall, his thin hands folded loosely in his lap. He had eaten little since his arrest, spoken even less. The warders muttered that he stared at the ceiling through the night, as if waiting for something that would not come. By the third morning, Maigret knew he could not leave him to silence. Cases did not close with paperwork. They closed with the slow untying of knots, and this knot, though captured, remained tightly bound. The inspector entered with his heavy, deliberate tread, pipe unlit between his teeth. He sat opposite the man, the iron table between them. For a long while, neither spoke. The damp air of the cell clung to the stone, and somewhere down the corridor, a key turned in a lock. At last, Maigret struck a match, lit his pipe, and let the smoke drift across the room. "You knew it would end here," he said quietly. The man gave a faint shrug, almost a gesture of relief. "Everything ends. Faces, names. Why not this?" His voice was low, steady. No hysteria, no pleading. Only a dull certainty that chilled more than defiance would have. Maigret studied him, the hollows of his cheeks, the scars on his fingers, where chemicals had burned. A man of shadows, brought into the light, yet still somehow absent. "Tell me why," Maigret said, not as demand but as invitation. For a long moment the man remained still, his gaze on the smoke curling upward. Then he leaned forward, his hands tightening slightly on the table. "There was a girl," he said. "Once. Long ago, she asked me to take her picture. I did. She smiled. It was a small smile, but it was hers. I kept that photograph. I thought it would last. But when she left, when she married another, her face in that picture mocked me. It reminded me of everything I had lost, so I destroyed it. I scraped her away. And when I looked at the empty oval, I felt calmer, as though she had never existed, as though the pain had been erased with her. The words fell without emotion, but their weight filled the room." Maigret smoked in silence, his eyes fixed on the man's trembling hands. "After that," the man continued, "I could not stop. Every face reminded me. Faces lie. They promise permanence, but they vanish, they betray. So I took them away before they could betray me again, each one, until there were no more faces, only the truth beneath, nothing. The confession was not shouted, not dramatic. It was whispered into the heavy air, more like an explanation offered to himself than to the inspector. When it ended, the silence returned, thicker than before. Maigret tamped the ash from his pipe and rose slowly. "You've told me enough," he said. His tone carried no triumph. There was no victory here. Only the quiet closure of a wound that would never fully heal. But the case did not end with words alone. That night, before the man could be transferred, a fire broke out in the evidence room. Whether by accident or design, no one could say. When the smoke cleared, many of the photographs were gone, reduced to blackened curls of ash. Only a handful survived, singed at the edges, their hollow faces peering faintly from the charred paper. Maigret stood among the ashes, his face grave, his pipe unlit. He felt no anger, only a weary resignation. Perhaps it was the man himself who had arranged it. Perhaps it was chance, but the photographs had not wished to remain. Their silence was complete now, carried away in smoke. The following morning, as the sun rose weakly over Paris, Maigret walked along the Seine. The river moved slowly, its waters reflecting the pale light, carrying debris from the night's rain. He thought of the drowned woman clutching her faceless photograph, of the whispers in Montparnasse, of the provincial echoes that had spread like ripples. He thought of the man in his cell, emptied of everything but his obsession. And he thought of the faces, faces once alive, now lost not only to erasure, but to fire. Madame Maigret was waiting when he returned home. She said nothing at first, only poured him coffee and set the bread before him. After a while she asked, "Is it finished?" Maigret blew gently on his cup, his heavy eyes fixed on the steam. "Finished enough," he said. She nodded, as though she had expected no other answer. Some cases ended cleanly with arrests and verdicts. Others ended in silence, in ashes, in the quiet knowledge that something broken could not be mended. This was one of those. That evening, as Paris resumed its rhythm, kiosks shouting new headlines, cafes buzzing with rumour, Maigret sat in his office, pipe smoke rising slowly. The public would tire of the story soon enough, moving on to another scandal, another curiosity, but he would remember the attic, thick with chemicals, the voids in the photographs, the hoarse whisper of confession. He would remember not because of crime alone, but because of the shadow it had cast on the fragile fabric of identity itself. He leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the hum of the city through the windows. Faces passed in the street outside, clerks, shopgirls, students, mothers, each one fleeting, each one destined to fade. And yet, in their passing, they were real. That, perhaps, was the only permanence left. Maigret drew slowly on his pipe, the ember glowing in the dim light. The case was closed, but its echo lingered. Not in the headlines, not in the files, but in the silence of the inspector himself, who carried the weight of faces erased and of the man who had tried, in vain, to erase his own. And so it ended, not with triumph, not with resolution, but with ashes and silence, fitting for a city that forgets even as it remembers.